Welcome to a special edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. A couple weeks ago, I did a three-part series taking a look at what has become the gold standard for critical study of the text of the Septuagint that is associated with Göttingen, Germany. It's the Göttingen Critical Edition. And that was hopefully a helpful set of videos, but it's not the only one. It's not the only larger edition, so to speak. So in this video and the one to come, we're going to move from Germany over across to England to take a look at a different major edition that is associated with Cambridge. It's known colloquially as the larger Cambridge Septuagint. So excited to do a couple videos on this one as well. What's very nice about this is that it is freely available. Unlike the Göttingen edition, you can find all of the PDFs of this edition on archive.org. In the Daily Dose special links on the website, you can find access to that as well, or just Google it, you'll find it pretty quickly. But very nice to have this in a freely accessible form. So let's dig into this edition. There's a nice picture of King's College Parade there from the late 1800s. And let's begin with the predecessor of the larger Cambridge edition. The predecessor was Henry Barclay Sweet's The Old Testament in Greek according to the Septuagint, which is essentially the text of Vaticanus where it exists, and some other supplementary editions. This was published in 1887, 1894, so it goes back quite a bit earlier than the German effort. And it was a 3-volume hand or manual edition. What that means is that it's fairly limited in its textual apparatus. It was meant to be more a day-to-day driver, if you will. In a lot of ways, you can think of it as the equivalent to the Rolf's edition, or now the Rolf's Hanhart edition, to the extent that the Rolf's edition is the short version of the Göttingen edition, and really was its predecessor. The same thing is true for Sweet's edition. It becomes really the basis for the larger one as well. And this is Sweet here, very, very talented man, did a lot of things. He also didn't have Netflix, so he had a lot of time on his hands as well. The larger Cambridge Septuagint sort of picks up where Sweet left off, and it was edited by Alan Brooke. A little picture of him here. Norman MacLean, couldn't find a picture of his face, but this is his gravestone. And Henry Thackeray, and it is known as, or named, the Old Testament in Greek according to the text of Codex Vaticanus, and I find that to be quite interesting in some respects. This should have been the title of the Sweet edition, and the Sweet edition should have been the title of this one, but I digress. It was released in multiple volumes from 1906 to 1940, as we'll see here in a bit. Sadly, it was never completed, but it does cover some of the books for which there is not yet a Göttingen edition, and I'll cover that here in a bit. So, very massive effort over a long period of time, and keep in mind that this is pre-computer, so their ultimate output was really quite impressive. Here is the first volume, is Genesis, which was released in the early 1900s, followed by Exodus and Leviticus, as well as Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then finally the other historical books, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, so that rounds out the Octateuch there, the Pentateuch plus 3. Then they did the later historical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, then 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st Esdras, which is actually an apocryphal book, or in the Deuterocanon, Ezra and Nehemiah, and then rounding out Esther, Judith, and Tobit. At that point, Thackeray had died, and the effort basically kind of wound down. So let's just summarize the specific volumes. The Pentateuch came out from 1906 to 1911, Joshua, Judges, Ruth in 1917, the Book of Samuel, or 1st and 2nd Kingdoms, 1927, 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, or what we call 1st and 2nd Kings, 1930, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or the Paralipomena, 1932, Ezra and Nehemiah plus the Deuterocanonical book, 1935, 1st Esdras, and then Esther plus Judith and Tobit, also Deuterocanonical books in 1940. And that's where, again, things left off. Now, I'll point out that here are some of the volumes that are not paralleled in the Göttingen edition, and therefore, at least not yet. So you go back to that video on the Göttingen edition, you'll see some of the people who are working on the remaining volumes that don't yet have published editions. So for the larger Cambridge Septuagint, you can use this instead. So Joshua exists, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st Chronicles. So for these books, the larger Cambridge Septuagint is your go-to, whereas there are Göttingen editions that in many respects surpass the overall breadth and quality of the larger Cambridge Septuagint, but it's still actually useful. I mean, I as we'll see here in a minute, I sometimes find the apparatus of the larger Cambridge Septuagint to be a little bit more easy to use or user-friendly. Now, it may not have all the evidence in there, certainly when it comes to papyri and so forth, but it's still quite useful. So even beyond the books, even for the books where we do have a Göttingen edition, it's still sometimes useful to consult the larger Cambridge. Let's talk about the goals of the larger Cambridge Septuagint. They say in the preface to the Genesis volume, this: the object of our work, and this is actually quite important, is to present as clearly and fully as possible, within reasonable limits of space, the evidence available for the reconstruction of the text or texts, plural, notice that, of the LXX or Septuagint. What that means is it's going to be a big apparatus that separates it from like Sweet or Rolf's Honhart. So it is a large critical edition, multi-volume, that kind of thing. However, and this is very different than the Rolf's or Göttingen approach. They further say what they mean by the evidence available for the reconstruction. Here's what they mean. It was decided that it would be premature. Keep in mind they're late 1800s, early 1900s. To attempt to provide a reconstructed or true text in this edition. In other words, they are not striving to give an eclectic text that they think approximates the Old Greek. Therefore, the text of the Vatican manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, should be followed wherever extant. So it's going to include portions like in Genesis where we don't have Vaticanus. And in those situations, it's the Clune being supplied from the Alexandrian or other uncial manuscripts. So what are the implications of this? It is a diplomatic edition in the main text borrowed from Sweet. It is not an eclectic edition. It is not attempting to say, hey, we think this is the Old Greek that represents the earliest form of the text and so forth. It's not trying to do that. They just picked one. And in essence, the apparatus is going to be just data that you can use on your own to try to reconstruct. It's a very different approach. So you can't simply go to the larger Cambridge and say, hey, here's what we think the text was in 200 BC. It's not. It's what Vaticanus is, at least if it exists. It's not missing in that section. And then you have to use the textual apparatus to figure out the rest on your own. Now, what is its approach? They began, as mentioned, with the Sweet edition, but they did make a few alterations that they tend to mark with the sort of dagger kind of thing, the plus or the cross-looking sign. And they say, we have endeavored to give the substantial variants found, again, in this massive apparatus that we'll look at in a second. It includes all the extant majuscules, or what they call uncials, as they existed in their day. I'll show you a list of those in a second. 30 minuscules. Now, this was for the Genesis edition. No doubt they added others as time went on. It's still a smaller number than the Göttingen edition, which is approaching about 100 or more. Philo and Josephus, early Christian writers, the other versions, which we'll talk about in a second, and select hexapolaric readings. Again, we'll show you that in due course. Here's a sample, at least for the Pentateuch, of the uncials or majuscules. So you'll see Codex Alexandrinus, of course, Vaticanus, so A and B, the Cotton Genesis, Codex E, which I don't know if I included that one in the Göttingen video. It may be that it wasn't in the prefatory material that I was using for the Göttingen edition, but it is found at least in some of the larger Cambridge editions. F, G, H, K, and L, those are some fragmentary things, plus the Vienna Genesis. A few other things that some of them are not mentioned in the Göttingen edition as such, or maybe they have different labels. For instance, the use of U in the larger Cambridge edition is a reference to a variety of papyri, which again, there weren't a lot available yet whenever McLean and so forth were working on this. They grew over time, and so they'll use these subscripts on U to capture that. A series of deltas. Most of these are quite fragmentary. A lot of later fragmentary majuscules, the theta for the Washington Codex and so forth. Now, this isn't meant to be a complete list, and sometimes the way in which they reference them is going to differ than the Göttingen edition, so you always have to be aware that you got to look back at the preface to make sure that you know exactly what they're using a certain letter or like a delta for, and it may not be the same thing as in the Göttingen edition. But pretty good coverage of the majuscules. When we move to the minuscules, here's a list at least from, I believe, the Genesis volume. And again, it's going to change based on the particular book you're looking at, so I don't want to include all of them. Now, what they tend to do is use letters. So A, B, these lowercase letters, as you can see. And then once you run out of letters, then they use subscripts. In parentheses, they do provide some of the numbers that are more familiar. The Göttingen edition will use the numbers. And generally speaking, these numbers will be the same as what we see in the Göttingen edition. But instead of using the numbers in the apparatus, the larger Cambridge uses the letters, and sometimes they might even say, look, it's going to be A through F, which basically means it's going to include all of these. I don't love that. I find that to be a bit confusing. Part of that is it's just annoying to use these letters and to kind of do it in this cryptic way. But also, if you go back to the Göttingen edition, the lowercase letters mean largely different things in the Göttingen edition. They typically refer to families of manuscripts as opposed to individual manuscripts. So you have to be aware that they're not using labels the same way across the board. But that's just one of the hazards we deal with when we move across different critical editions. Especially these larger ones. So just be aware of that. What about some of the other evidence here? Let's take a look at the extra stuff. So they Philo and Josephus, as mentioned. They do cite the New Testament quite regularly, but they do mention in their upfront material that oftentimes use of this stuff is quite difficult because there's all sorts of factors in terms of how did the wording get remembered, and is it intended to be a direct citation of something that you can use text critically, or if it's just a vague remembrance, then you can't. And so they're very much aware of that. They get into some of the Greek fathers, like the Apostolic Fathers, Justin Martyr, Theophilus, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Origen, Adamantius, Eusebius, Athanasius, and there's a small tail. There's a few others, but those are the main ones. Latin fathers, similar. You're going to look at Cyprian, Innovation, Hilary. They don't use as much of the Latin tradition as you might see, for instance, on the New Testament side of the equation. Interestingly enough, they include the Vulgate, really sort of like a Jerome witness. They have a separate category for the Old Latin under the versions. They're going to look at the Armenian, the Coptic, the Ethiopic, the Old Latin, the Palestinian, Aramaic, and the Syro-Hexapla. And so they typically will use slightly annoying Gothic letters for these, and so just be aware of that. You'll have to look at the upfront list of abbreviations to even make sense of what the versions are, because they're going to look a little bit funny on the page. Well, without further ado, let's take a look at the layout. And here I'm just going to draw on numbers here. And so you can see just based on this high-level view that it's big apparatus, relatively small amount of text. In fact, you might just have a few lines on the page and the rest of it is apparatus, because again, they're trying to just give you a bunch of data that you can go and then use to reconstruct the text. They're not themselves trying to actually reconstruct the Old Greek text. So now let's take a look a little bit more closely at each of the components on the page. Let's start at the top of the page, and you can see that the book title on the first page of the book will be listed. So that's arithmoi, which is numbers. Over here on the left, you have the verse numbers and the chapter number here. Similar to the Göttingen edition and others, they will list the verse numbers down the left margin that then correspond with where they are, at least the line in which you actually see the verse number start. So 2 is over here, 3 is going to be found either here or here, slight variant there. 4 down here. I guess it's actually right here, begins in the beginning of the line. 5, and so on. 6 here. So I find that to be quite helpful in terms of navigating your way on the page. Now, next thing I'll mention, this top right, you'll see there's a B and then a GH. These are the principal manuscripts that supply the text, and normally that's going to be Vaticanus, maybe with some assistance from others if there are gaps and so on. So they just list that there just to remind you at the start of a chunk of text. So that's going to be above the fold. I do like the typography in general. It's pretty clean. You don't see, big footnote indicators and that kind of stuff. I'll get into that in a second. And so pretty helpful, nice clean layout here, especially for its day, pretty impressive. Moving down the page a bit, right underneath the text, they have 2 very small mini apparatuses, if you will. The first one are iticisms or ioticisms and small errors in the principal manuscripts that are cited. And specifically what they're going to look at is what did Sweet use, which is usually Vaticanus, but maybe some others. And do we need to make you aware of any very small spelling issues that aren't really major textual variants? They're meant to just say, hey, look, this is a orthographic issue or something like that. So you can see even the first one is just the spelling of Sinai there maybe varies. It could be misspellings. Honestly, I'm not really sure why they do this, because a lot of this material is going to be repeated down in the apparatus below, but they do. The next bit are going to be a summary list of the manuscripts and the versions that are cited in the big apparatus to follow. So at a quick glance, you can say, okay, here's what's included on this page in the apparatus. So it's a bunch of uncials, some of the minuscules, and some of the versions. And those are some of the lettering that I mentioned earlier, the sort of Gothic letters to describe the Bohairic, Coptic, or the Old Latin, or what have you. So honestly, most of this stuff you can probably skip. The main event, of course, is down here, the big apparatus. And you'll see it's formatted into 2 columns. It's going to begin on the left-hand side with the chapter and verse number. Then you see the verse number and so on. See over here, verse 4, verse 5, and so forth. So that's helpful. But let's zoom in to get a feel for how the apparatus works. Here I've just copied down the text from verse 1, so we have it as a point of reference. And here are some of the basics. And this is where it's slightly different than, say, the Nestle-Aland New Testament or the Göttingen edition that you may be familiar with. And so let's begin with a few observations. First off, you'll notice that it takes a lemma approach, just like the Göttingen edition. It doesn't put footnotes and that kind of stuff in the text itself, like you do have on the New Testament side with the UBS or Nestle tradition. Instead, you take a portion of text, like Mausein here, and you put it down in the apparatus, and it says, okay, here's a variant for that word. So this will be the word Mausein right here. That's what's going on. They say, all right, let's copy that text down, and let's show you some variants. After they show the lemma, they will use this right square bracket. That's what you see right here. You can also see it down here with to eremo. You can see it right here. So that says, okay, here's the start of that variant, and that separates the lemma from the other evidence. And so after Mausein here, you see that one set of manuscripts, those again are some of the minuscules, they spell it Mosein without that upsilon, and then yet another one spells it Mose here. So these are the 2 options for how to spell Mausein in a different kind of way. Now, before we skip ahead, you'll notice that there is a colon right here. That is kind of an interesting little innovation here. I don't really love this. I find it to be a little bit confusing, but that's what separates different options or different readings for a given variant. And so for Mausein here, you've got this option and you've got this option. They separate it with the colon. And so you see the same thing down here and here, here. Those are all separating different options for a given textual variant. Lastly, when you get to the end of this particular variant unit, so for instance, when we get to the end of the different spellings from Mausein, they do a prominent vertical pipe there, vertical bar, and say, okay, here's the next one, vertical bar, here's the next one, and so on. So you'll see the N here is going to correspond to this N. It's going to refer to that. And then you have, after this vertical bar, you got te eremo, which is now referring to this, and so on. You can look farther ahead. You got martyriu here after this vertical bar, which was for Sinai here, which I have a different spelling. And so martyriu here is referring to that one, and so on. So hopefully that's a helpful little basic orientation. Once you get the hang of it, it's really not too bad. Now, what are some of the abbreviations? Let's look a little bit farther down the page just to get you a feel for this. Let's begin with the plus sign, and that indicates that whatever shows up in the list of variants has been added after the lemma text. Let me show you an example. So we see there is a plus sign right here that says, okay, altone follows the lemma. So let's go backwards a bit and let's find the lemma, which is sungenias. Let me show you the text here. This is from verse 2, as you can see. And so a bunch of manuscripts have this sungenias. So Vaticanus does, a bunch of minuscules, some of the versions and so forth. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but sometimes what they'll do, they don't always do this, but if they want to show the evidence for the reading in Vaticanus, they'll include it before they show you that close bracket. So fair enough. Now, some manuscripts, instead of sungenias, have tas sungenias altone. In fact, just one manuscript has that. Then notice a little break there for the next variant, and then some manuscripts have a plus altone. In other words, after sungenias is this altone. In other words, you'll see after sungenias down here, some manuscripts will have that altone. In fact, it's Alexandrinus and a bunch of others, and so on. So that's how the plus sign works. Kind of makes sense. What about the PR? That means precedes. That is, the lemma is preceded by the text shown. Let's go back up to the start here. You have archein, corresponding down here, and it's preceded in 2 manuscripts by the article tain. So what that means is in those manuscripts, tain shows up right here before archem. So that's very nice and compact way. They don't have to list the whole variant. They just say, okay, it's preceded by this word. Fair enough. And then lastly, we have omission. OM means that the limit text itself is omitted. And so let me give you an example of that. So you see omit right here, and this is patreion, which is down here, and it actually feeds into the next verse. So it's patreion plus auton plus some more words in verse 3. All of that is omitted is what they're trying to say. So those manuscripts don't have that at all. So that's a very brief introduction to the sort of basic nuts and bolts of how the apparatus works. It's pretty straightforward. They don't get too fancy with a lot of acronyms and so forth. What they'll tend to do is err on the side of being lengthier, if you will, showing more of the text as opposed to trying to shrink it down with lots of complicated Latin, abbreviations and that kind of stuff. It tends to be fairly straightforward, pretty easy to read once you get the hang of it. Lastly, if you go down to the very bottom of the page, you'll see yet another apparatus, which is, I think, our 4th at this point. And I'm going to quote them at full here. This is their miniature hexapla apparatus. And so what you can tell here, this sigma would be Symmachus, this alpha would be Aquila, and so on. And here's what they say. Our 3rd set of notes, which is technically the 4th set of notes, if you include that list of manuscript witnesses, contains the hexaplaric material found in the margins of those manuscripts, MSS, which we quote continuously. So that would be like Vaticanus and Alexandrinus and so forth, and of the Syro-hexaplar version, which I'll have to cover in a separate video down the road. We do not think it our duty to include in our selection all manuscripts with marginal hexaplaric material. In other words, this is not a full hexapla project. Part of that is, I don't know, they're already doing a lot with this, and the hexapla project didn't exist yet. Or to collect such matter from other sources, for the result would only have been the reprinting of a greater part of Field's hexapla. So they're basically like, hey, Frederick Field just came out with this hexapla, which is actually pretty true. It's not too long before this massive 2-volume set that I'll cover in a separate video. We didn't feel like we needed to print all of that in this. This was already going to be a big project. So basically, go look at Field. But when a manuscript was chosen for its own text, like Vaticanus or what have you, it seemed desirable to give the whole of its evidence. So in other words, if you find certain manuscript that they're using as the main text and it has footnotes or marginal annotations that refer to Aquila or something like that, they want to include it to represent that manuscript. And so they've added that. But they say none of this is of great importance. So basically, this apparatus is just extra bits that may or may not be in Field. In fact, most of it probably is. He says, but even if it's not found in Field's edition of the hexapla, it's probably not that important. So it's not super helpful there at the bottom, because essentially if you have Field's hexapla, which again I'll cover in a different video, you have what you need. So here's that's the end of the kind of whirlwind tour of the apparatus and what we see on the page. What I'm going to do in video part 2 of all this is compare how it handles certain things with, say, the Göttingen edition, do some case studies and so forth. So that'll be the next video. This is enough for today. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this has been a helpful introduction to the larger Cambridge Septuagint. And again, if you want to look at the actual facsimiles, if you want to look at the very nice copies that I've been using, again, there's a link to that in the important daily dose links. Very straightforward to find on archive.org. Download it, save the PDFs, you'll use them. Very helpful stuff. That's enough for today. Thanks for tuning in.